Well, thank you everyone for joining us for the latest in the MillerKnoll Insight series online. My name is Mark Catchlove and I lead the MillerKnoll Insight Group. And in case you don't know MillerKnoll, MillerKnoll is a family of brands, all of which you can see in front of you. And these companies design and manufacture products for places where people live, where they learn, where they get healed, and where they work. And today is all about workplace. And I'm really pleased to have my colleague Joseph White with us today. Joseph is part of the MillerKnoll Global Research and Planning Group and has the role as Director of Design Strategy. I'm sure he'll tell you a little bit more about what he does, but he's going to be looking at the rise of relationship-based work. Do feel free to use the chat box for questions and observations as we go along. Joseph, thank you for giving us your time. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you to all of you who joined and are giving us some of your time today. I'm going to do my best to make it well worth your while. So as Mark said, I'm Director of Design Strategy on MillerKnoll's Global Research and Planning team. Global Research and Planning is a team of researchers, insight sharers, workplace strategists, and designers who conduct research globally and work directly with our most important clients and partners to help them elevate the value of place. My work specifically serves as a link between research and design practice. It draws on our insights about human behavior in the built environment to help organizations decide what kind of places to create, understand why those places are important, and create plans to adapt those places as people's expectations change over time. Now, we use the word planning rather than design to more accurately describe how we can help in the overall process of creating places. The word design often carries connotations of finality and completeness, whereas planning implies possibility and iteration. While we don't offer complete architectural design, we do offer a broad range of planning ideas and solutions that can be leveraged to help create places where people love to be. And today, I'm really excited to share with you MillerKnoll's point of view on the importance of planning for relationship-based work. But before diving in, I'll pose this question: are we attached? There are probably only a couple people on this call that I've seen in person many times and know very well. Sociologists refer to that type of connection as a strong tie. There are probably a few others, quite a few others actually, that we've met a few times, and those relationships sociologists refer to as weak ties or loose ties. Those are folks that we don't know quite as well, but we still recognize. For much more of you, this is our first interaction. And so if we meet again in the future, we'll build on that, and then we'll be on a path towards creating a stronger relationship. Now, those dynamics of relationship exist between people, but they also exist between places. And oftentimes we gravitate to the same spaces over and over again because of a concept called place attachment. And this is a concept that comes from environmental psychology. And it refers to how we bond with a given environment and how that environment in turn shapes our emotions, our behaviors, our performance, and our well-being. So we can build these positive relationships with places just as we do with other people. And we may think about placement attachments much in the same way as we think about strong and weak ties. We would generally rather spend time with people that we know and love most, rather than get to know a new group of people, especially when we're feeling stressed or sad or insecure. And in the same capacity, we prefer to occupy places that are familiar to us and that we feel a sense of ownership and attachment to. So when we think about our relationships to both people and places, there are certain factors that contribute to the strength of those connections. And those are things like convenience of access and the overall amount of time that we spend with that person or place, our own personal preferences, familiarity, intimacy, and the overall emotional intensity that we experience when we interact with that person or place. And then also the reciprocal nature of the relationship. So how do we contribute to each other? What do we gain from each other from those interactions? So in the minutes ahead, I'm going to be unpacking these ideas a bit more and talk about more specifically how you can use them to create places. So this presentation is broken down into 3 parts. There's an overview on the current context of people's expectations on work and an introduction to the concept of relationship-based work. Then we're going to go into a deep dive on how we view interaction between colleagues and use that kind of matrix understanding in order to point towards specific types of settings that can help us plan for relationship-based work. Over several decades, MillerKnoll's global research and planning team has built a body of research that helps us understand a few things about what makes a great workplace experience. So let's take a look at some recent data from our work. We've learned that interacting with others is the primary driver for why employees want to come to the office. And these statistics come from Future Forum's global survey of over 10,000 knowledge workers distributed across the US, Australia, France, Germany, Japan, and the UK. And this was conducted back in winter of 22. And they found that the top 2 drivers motivating employees to come into the office were looking at things like collaboration and camaraderie. A more recent study found similar results. The factors most likely to draw people into the office are teamwork, socializing, and connection, as well as access to spaces that support those interactions. And those stats fall out like this, with 22% prioritizing teamwork specifically, then 18% for socialization, and 17% for a general sense of connection. And from our research and work with clients, we know that the workplace can be a powerful tool in helping to create a sense of belonging. And this happens through improved work experiences for the individuals that form highly diverse communities within organizations. And it should be recognized that community is the foundation for how organizations function. So as more organizations prioritize connection, collaboration, and culture in this new era of work, the workplace must take on a new role to develop and grow relationships. And we've known for decades that every office has a climate of social expression, and that can either be destructive or constructive. And to a large degree, this is affected by the physical expression that we give it. And now that social expression needs to change. It's not about putting everyone into one big open space with the intent of building community. You need a much more nuanced mix of spaces that addresses all of the different ways that individuals show up and form relationships with each other and their work. And this is largely because of the shift in how work happens today. The transformation of modern work has been bigger than a technology-enabled, pandemic-fueled race to work from anywhere. Today, the value of workplace is less about how many activities complete while they're there, and it's more about how well the physical space supports the relationships that enable great work. Now let's take a look at how work began to shift its focus from looking primarily at activities and prioritizing activities to prioritizing relationships. And this all started several decades ago. In 1983, an American architect named Robert Luchetti co-invented the concept of the office as a series of activity settings. More than a decade later, in his book, The Demise of the Office, Dutch workplace consultant and author Eric Veldhoen coined the term activity-based working. For the following 30 years, these ideas have proven remarkably resilient as the value people got from their workplace rose or fell depending on how well or how poorly it supported their work activities. And the notion of activity-based work has proven remarkably resilient since the idea first surfaced nearly, actually even more than 40 years ago. And in fact, many workplace strategists still consider supporting activity-based working as leading-edge policy. So I want to be very clear here that activity-based work has been a major advancement in terms of supporting work and creating workplaces. And this concept of relationship-based work really builds on that core foundation to take it to the next step. So I'm going to take you through a series of slides that talk about the relationships between those two things. And to do that, I'm going to start introducing a visual graphic language. So when we think about activity-based work, an activity-based model focuses on the work task. The word is literally right up front, activity-based work. And in this instance, activities are represented by these various squares on the screen. And in this model, you create environments that are specifically tailored to support those different activities. And it sets this frame of mind of, what am I doing now? What am I doing next? What am I doing next? And that kind of forwarding the activity mindset. When we start shifting to think about a relationship-based model, the graphic language here shifts from the square representing an object of work to a circle representing the person. And so we're taking the relationship that drives the work and bringing that forward, not only in the title, the word, the name, but also in the mindset. And so what you start to see here in this graphic language is, rather than illustrating work with these squares, we are illustrating relationships between people. And so we see these circles representing individuals, and then these different styles of line that represent the different types of relationships. At the beginning of the hour, I mentioned folks that I know very well and have met many times in person, and having a strong tie relationship. In this graphic language, we see this kind of solid line that represents that strong tie relationship versus folks that I don't know quite as well, represented by these dotted line relationships. So these strong and weak ties, relationships between people, you're going to see those graphics show up again a bit later in the presentation. So while for many organizations, supporting activity-based work is still a viable workplace strategy, many desk-based workers can complete their activities from almost anywhere. And in response, the role of the workplace is shifting. And there's a really important thing here to understand. So since knowledge workers can complete their tasks almost anywhere, there's been this drive to more distributed work, more remote work. We have to be careful with this dynamic and what it can actually do to the relational strength, the relational bonds within an organization. A recent study found that an 18-month period of mandatory remote work resulted in a substantial loss of weak ties. And those are the ties between distant parts of a social system of work that actually enable the flow of new ideas within an organization. And this study was completed among a group of nearly 3,000 researchers at a large North American university. So over that period of time, they found that their communications with folks outside their immediate group began to diminish, and no new connections with other folks outside of that group were being formed. This is a critical finding that shows the importance of co-location. And when that group started to come back in a hybrid form, they actually started to see many of those ties begin to reform in a partial capacity that mirrored that kind of partial reintroduction of co-location. So while there's been this shift, the office is no longer the only place where work happens, but it is and remains the best place to establish, maintain, and build the relationships that actually drive work forward. So when we think about the difference between activity-based work and relationship-based work, what does that mean for the design of physical places and how we plan for workplace? I want to illustrate that with a simple analogy. So here on the screen, activity is to interaction as relationship is to connection. Activities and interactions are episodic, while relationships are connections, are enduring. So what we're talking about here is this differentiation in time scale. Or am I thinking of a short-term focus? What am I doing now? What am I doing next? What am I doing next? Or am I thinking more of a long-term focus about the people that I know, those relationships that exist before, during, and long after any work task is completed? Which one are we prioritizing? So if we look at these two models of activity-based work and relationship-based work, what does this mean for how we plan for physical spaces? So one model points to the need of a variety of spaces to support a range of different work tasks. And as I mentioned earlier, this has been an incredibly important milestone innovation in how work is approached and designed, and design is structured to support it. But this other model adds to that variety of space with this dynamic of participatory design practices. So actually engaging people in the design of the workplace. And to say that another way, this is designing with, not just for employees. And there are many ways that you can do that, that you can engage people in that design of place, whether that's through team working agreements, where you encourage individual working teams to come together and talk about when and how they're going to show up for each other, the vehicles of communication they're going to use, the role that place plays in their work, and having that intentional dialogue around how they use place as a tool. Those working agreements are not only great for helping a team work better together, but an organization can look at those working agreements in aggregate to start to understand both the quality and quantity of physical space that's needed. So it becomes this amazing planning tool. Also, looking at informal feedback and more formal surveys is another great way to collect data and engage people in the design of place. And then lastly, this one is my personal favorite, affinity groups within organizations. Sometimes these are referred to as employee resource groups, business resource groups. These are ways for people to find other types of connections that are not dependent on their actual formal role within an organization. And so this starts to open up the opportunity to form stronger bonds, not only with the organization and the work that's being done, but with their peers, with their coworkers, to have more of a multifaceted relationship. So all of these ways, these potential ways to engage people in dialogue around the design of place have another amazing benefit. Aside from providing great input on how to plan that place, they help contribute to this concept of place attachment that I started with earlier. So this notion that with repeated exposure, with repeated quality exposure that means something, we can begin to form that relationship. So when you engage people in that dialogue around workplace planning, it really helps to advance that process, helping them form relationships with others, with their organization, and even indeed with the physical places that they've had a hand in creating. So how do we take all of this theory and start to put it into practice? To understand what support for relationship-based work looks like, we first need to understand how relationships and ideas form and evolve over time through a series of interactions among and between people. And so I've got a series of diagrams that I'm going to walk you through to help kind of unpack that and lead towards a variety of settings that can be used to create a unique kind of social infrastructure, if you will, within an organization's workplace. Now, I'm going to ask you to recall the visual language that I was referring to earlier in those slides on activity-based work and relationship-based work, where we had the squares representing an object of work and circles representing people, with different line styles representing the different types of relationships between them. So this is the first step of that series of diagrams. We look at these levels of interaction that happen between and among people. And if we start over on the right-hand side, looking at the individual, this one is relatively obvious. So this is kind of the focus and attention of one person. When we take a step to the left and we look at the group level, this is two or more people with a defined relationship, a defined or a strong relationship to each other. And then the next tier over at the community level, this is representation by two or more groups that have a relationship to each other. Now, this is more likely going to be a loose tie connection or a weak tie connection, because these are folks that don't interact on a day-to-day basis, but they do still recognize and know each other. Now, when we talk about these two different types of relationships, the strong tie and the weak tie, each of those have a very specific role to play when it comes to how ideas form and move throughout an organization. And this is really critical when you start thinking about dynamics like creativity, innovation, productivity, those sorts of things. So when we look at strong tie connections, these are really great for building trust and understanding and taking clearly defined ideas and implementing them flawlessly, pushing them forward, getting into that kind of really productive mode. The risk here, if you only focus on building this type of relationship, is you start to get information silos within organizations. You lose the capacity to introduce new ideas to different parts of the organization, and that begins to limit the capacity for creativity and innovation within an organization. That's where the loose tie connections become critically important. So you need to have folks from different groups coming and meeting folks from other groups so that they can start to cross-pollinate ideas. And you can begin to use these three layers of individual, group, and community almost as a diagnostic tool to look at an existing workplace to assess, do we have the different types of environments that are needed for individuals to feel well-grounded and focused in their own priorities, to connect with their teams and have a really clear understanding of how they're going to be productive and successful, and then the overall organization context and how all of those different teams are working together in a bigger picture to achieve the ultimate organization's objectives. This can be a great step if this is the first time you're thinking about these concepts, just to think about your workplace in these three lenses of individual, group, and community. But it really does help to take this a step further. So I think while we can all understand that people simultaneously show up as individuals, members of groups, and representatives of larger community, we don't always show up with the same intent. And that kind of comes back to what we expect out of those moments of interaction when we show up. Now, it can be really difficult, if not impossible, to codify all of the different things that people might do when they're showing up in a workplace. But we can generalize them into these two really high-level buckets. The row on the top we refer to as exchange and reflect. You can think of this as exploratory work. This is the fuzzy front end. And then the row at the bottom, this produce row, this is more task-oriented work. This is where we really get into very clear production. And so at the top, where we're exchanging and reflecting upon ideas around what are we going to do? Why are we going to do it? How are we going to get it done? That kind of messy front end of starting a new project. Then once you're able to reflect on those ideas, discuss, form a plan, the brain switches into this mode of production. We know what we're doing. We're going to come together and we're going to align our resources, get focused, and get the work done. Now, it's important to realize that there's a continual cycle between these different types of engaging the mind. And in order to help facilitate that, we can now overlay this on different types of space. So what this delivers is essentially a typology of 6 different types of space, 2 each for individual, group, and community interaction. And when we start to look at the difference between that kind of fuzzy front end of exchange and reflect and that more task-oriented production mode at the bottom, we can start to get a sense of why you might design one space in one way and another space in another way. In fact, I'm just now thinking of, we've got a collaborator that Mark Ketchlove knows personally, Neil Usher, who we've collaborated with a number of times over the years. He has this phrase that I just love that is, today's innovation is tomorrow's productivity. And I think that layers on top of this diagram really well. So remembering that visual language that I was referring to earlier around the square representing an object of work and the circle representing a person, if we go through these just across the board at the individual level, there's a difference between an individual deeply immersing themselves in a work task or a mode of deep focused work versus intentionally separating from work to step away, to take a breath, to get a moment of restoration. This is a really important dynamic that has traditionally been missing from the workplace. But if you don't have those kind of well-balanced, well-centered individuals, they're going to have a really difficult time showing up at that group or team level and contributing in a really effective way. Now, at the group level, we can look at these 2 different modes of interaction in a really simple way. Now, I'll acknowledge that oftentimes these words meeting and collaboration are used synonymously, but they actually refer to two completely different dynamics. When we think about meeting, and again, this is that kind of exchange and reflect mode, this is a group of people communicating as one unit. They're all together at the same time, focusing on the same information and having really one dialogue. And so that's that dynamic of meeting where they're exchanging and reflecting on ideas together, deciding what work to do, how to do it, why they're going to do it, etc. Now, collaboration starts to shift because that group is now more dynamic, where you've got the group coming together and breaking apart as individuals, then back together and apart, together and apart over and over in a seamless cycle. And so when we create spaces for collaboration, we need to make sure that you have spaces where the individual can break apart for a moment, but within close proximity to quickly come back together to that group so that they can kind of complete that cycle. At the community level, when we look at these two different modes of exchange and reflect versus produce, we have this socialization space. And you'll notice there's no square in this sociogram example, this diagram. And that's because the primary purpose of this is social interaction. These types of environments aren't set up for people to show up with their PowerPoint presentation, pull up a big screen and draw everyone around. It's really there to prioritize getting to know someone in a capacity other than necessarily what's directly related to their work. Now, what often happens is work invariably enters the conversation, and that's a great thing. But really establishing that social connection is the primary piece here so that you can form those relationships with folks outside of your immediate working team. Now, communities absolutely are also able to complete work at that scale. And this is where we talk about spaces for assembly rather than socialization. So they're assembling for a specific purpose. And here you see the community centering around this object of work. So this might be an organization is rolling out a new strategy, there's an org change, there may be a new brand and visual language that is being implemented. Any number of things where you need to bring the entire organization together to focus on that a specific object of work. Now, it's also important to note that while these kind of six types of interaction, these six types of space will show up in every organization, the specific way that they show up will be different. And so what you're seeing on the screen now is this list of a variety of settings that can allow for the supporting of socialization or collaboration or focus in a way that respects the character of an organization. And this is just the fact of life that, some people in some organizations are more formal than others. Some prioritize face-to-face interaction. Some are more biased towards digital connections. Some are small, some are large, varying degree of characteristics can be used to create spaces for focus or assembly or meeting that align specifically with the character of the actual people that are using those spaces. So from this concept, I wanted to then show some actual physical examples. And again, these are just starting points. There are 18 different settings listed on the screen. I'm not going to go through all of these right now, and that is by no means the only ones. This is just kind of a framework to organize a larger body of environments. And so what we're doing here is taking these physical representations of space and then correlating them back to these different types of space that are designed to support the different types of relationships that exist within an organization. And so when we look at each of these images, I would ask you to look with a relational lens. Think about how at an individual level, this type of environment is supporting that person in their degree for individual focus, but also their ability to meet with others. When you look at that kind of group dynamic, what is that space doing to help strengthen those bonds between an individual working team or the ability of an environment to help others from different parts of the organizations connect in a way that feels comfortable and social for them. So, by the way, if you want to dive in more depth into these settings, we have a CEU called Redefining the Workplace that goes into much greater detail than I will over the next few slides. But this is just going to give you a bit of a sampling of some of these environments and connecting back to some of the ideas that I shared earlier in the talk. So when we look at this cafe space, this is a community setting that's in that exchange and reflect mode. These environments are really great for establishing those weak ties, helping to foster relationships with folks outside of our immediate working team. And one of the things that I love to point out in this environment is acknowledging that not everybody shows up in the same way. Yes, there are some folks that want to be right in the center, they want to see and be seen, but others may be a little more apprehensive and may need to find a place around on the periphery, on the fringe, where they can kind of keep an eye on what's going on, but maybe have some degree of prospect and refuge where they feel a little more shielded. And in this way, we can create places where people feel comfortable coming together, starting to establish relationships. And you can imagine how over time, if you've got someone who's kind of tucked over on the side and they see someone one day and then another day and then another day, and how that starts to lead to this forming of a relationship over time. Now, when we shift still in the community mode from this kind of socialization space and that exchange and reflect mode to something that's more geared towards that produce mode of interaction, you'll probably notice a shift in the way that this physical space is articulated. And some of the things that I like to point to are furniture on casters, whiteboards, things that laptop tables, things that really start to send signals to the brain that work happens here. And so this is a type of environment that's really flexible. It's intended to bring multiple groups together. You can have large kind of speaker and audience type dynamics, but it can also very quickly be configured to breakout groups, and you can kind of start to facilitate that dynamic of different groups kind of coming together and breaking apart. That flexibility is really important, not only to enable different types of interaction, but also to allow people to physically shape their space. So that concept of place attachment comes in again as well, where you have the ability for people to actually take control over their physical environment. When we go to the group tier, we've got a few different settings that we'll take a look at here. The first is this conference room space. And this is really good for creating a degree of stability for teams. And that comes from having a consistent experience. Like, yes, there are some chairs that can be easily moved here, but overall the room setup is pretty consistent. And that allows for the group to remain focused on the conversation. That's the primary purpose of this setting. And so configuring it in that way is something that's really important for keeping that overall cohesive one group dynamic. Now, when we shift from that exchange and reflect mode to the produce mode in the group category, we can see this workshop space. And again, thinking of that difference between meeting and collaboration, here you can see space where it's easy for the group to come together as a unit, but they can also break apart individually really seamlessly and stay in close physical proximity. So it's enabling that kind of coming together and breaking apart in a really fluid cycle to enable that dynamic of collaboration that we discussed earlier. And this is a really fantastic setting for helping to build strong tie connections within a working team. So that notion of repeated quality interactions over and over and over again helps people get to know each other really well, not only in terms of what they're doing from a work standpoint, but they can also start to get a sense of what each other's personal preferences are. And that just only adds to the strength of their understanding of each other and how they work and building those strong ties. Another type of group space for production are team neighborhoods. And it's important to acknowledge that not all team neighborhoods are the same. And that's important because not all groups are the same. They work in different ways. And a lot of that difference comes down to the types of work that they're doing for an organization. Whether it's a team that is being asked to answer questions that haven't been asked before and they're not quite sure what the path forward is going to look like, they're going to need a lot of flexibility to kind of come together and break apart, to iterate and try different things And that's what this type of team neighborhood that you're seeing on the screen is designed to do. You can see those spaces for quick, cohesive group interaction, but also spaces where they can break apart as individuals to kind of work on their own to help move work forward. Conversely, there can be a different type of team neighborhood that is balanced more towards the other end of the spectrum, which is more towards individual focus. And this is most likely for a team that is working with very clearly defined ideas. They know what the path forward looks like, and their job is to implement flawlessly. So the group spaces are, pushed more towards the background. They're not as prevalent, but those individual workspaces are the ones that are more key. And so understanding the dynamics of a different group is really important to make sure that you are tailoring their work neighborhood appropriately. When we look at the individual category, I wanted to show a couple examples here. So from the exchange and reflect tier of individual space, we have this respite space. And this is really for taking a step back, taking a step away from work to recenter on what your own values are, to just to think, collect your thoughts. And so you see these types of spaces that are in close physical proximity to individual and group production spaces so that people can have quick access to that to catch a beat when they need to. And there are certain environmental psychology considerations that are really important here to be able to cultivate that sense of respite. And these are things like introducing operable features like drapery or lighting that can be controlled, posture, like a range of posture that they can choose from. And that ability to have control over an environment is a really critical part to be able to create that sense of calm in the mind, to actually be able to step away. And you may not have control over your work schedule and your workload, but if you can control the immediate environment around you, that puts you on one step on that path to kind of regaining kind of control of your mental state. And that's really what these respite spaces are all about. Now, conversely, spaces for individual production are a bit different. And this environment itself is a bit different in that mode. I think oftentimes organizations think of an individual workstation as the place where a person goes for their individual work. But if that individual workstation is a multi-pack workstation, if I'm in a six-pack, then my desk is physically connected to 5 other people. When I approach that six-pack workstation, my brain immediately reads it as a group setting. And I really do think that we should categorize those as group settings, not individual settings. That doesn't mean that individual work can't happen there, but it does mean that the individual work is secondary to that group dynamic. And those multi-pack workstations serve a really important need. And that's, taking advantage of co-location of a group to drive work forward with that notion of supporting the individual as kind of like a secondary mode. Now, in this type of space that you're seeing on screen, this really is prioritizing that individual dynamic. And this is doing it in a way that you can think of as doing work alone together. And again, in that relational lens, thinking about the benefit of studying quietly alongside others and how you can take advantage of the momentum of quiet minds at work, if you will. So this type of environment would be set up like a reading room in a library, where talking is discouraged, if not forbidden, if you will. And there are different ways that that individual focus can be cultivated even within this environment. And so it's important to provide that variety because different people think and cultivate focus in different ways. So there's this kind of quiet library reading room table on one end, but then there are also these moments over on the side that are really quite simple with a high back chair that offers some degree of visual shielding and some quick storage to stash items over on the side. And having a seat like this that would have the ability to pivot, and even that simple ability of having blinders on either side and turning just ever so slightly gives you control over your visual field. And that is a very small intervention that has a significant impact in someone being able to cultivate the state of mind that they want to achieve for the type of work that they're doing. So now that I've shared a broad range of ideas around thinking about work and workplace a bit differently, shifting focus from activity to relationships, introduced some frameworks and diagrams to work through those concepts, and then some visual spaces, visual examples of spaces. I'm curious to see what sort of thoughts or questions may have arrived in the chat while I was going through that, and I will ask Mark to rejoin and help facilitate that part of the dialogue.
Great, thank you. There's plenty that you have to deal with here, Joseph, and I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts. So, and I really appreciate everyone's comments and views as you're going along, and thank you that some of you have been answering each other's questions, which is fantastic. I'm going to ask the first question from Matthew. Matthew Burgess says, do you have anything on how the strength of ties changes over time? What weak ties are latent strong ties? What about the strong ties that have decayed into weak ties? Do they retain a memory of their previous strength, which can be reactivated? I thought that was a fantastic question. It's like we need probably Dr. Andreas Hofbauer to help us on that.
Amazing question. Thank you so much for asking that. The dynamic of time is so important here, and and you mentioned Dr. Andreas Hofbauer. He's a sociologist. He's a close collaborator, and actually coming up on January 15th, he's going to be joining Zoe Chen from Veldone to provide another Insight Series presentation that will dive into some of those dynamics a little bit more. But I'd like to address your question a little bit as well. So again, the key factors that contribute to the strength of weak ties, and this is coming from the seminal work of Mark Granovetter, who is the sociologist that introduced this concept of strong and weak ties back in 1973, I believe it was. The factors that contribute to the strength of those relationships are the amount of time spent, the emotional intensity that's exchanged, the degree of intimacy, and so this is kind of mutual confiding between two entities, and then the reciprocal services that are offered. So what do they each get from each other? And when you look at those dynamics and how they're exchanged over time, that's where you get the difference in weak versus strong. So I made a distinction earlier around the difference between an interaction and a connection. If you think of an interaction as an episodic moment and a connection as something that's enduring, multiple interactions, multiple quality interactions become a connection over time. That connection must be maintained. It's kind of like airline status. If you don't keep earning it, you lose it, and it starts to diminish. And that study that I mentioned over an 18-month period with that group of researchers, what they found was that when co-location was removed, when everyone was remote, those interactions were reducing, and they started to see an atrophy of the connections that they had with other parts of the organization, and they started to kind of sink within themselves. So you could actually see silos forming based on the communication patterns that were quantified based on the email communications that they were sending between each other and other parts of the organization. So time has a huge component to play here. So it's like you need more interactions, and they need to be quality interactions, and they have to be maintained. And the quality of the interaction can come in when I was referencing like the business resource groups, employee resource groups, affinity groups. There are multiple ways that you can influence the quality of the interaction. So one is if you and I have the same functional role in an organization, that's kind of like one facet of our connection. If you and I have the same functional role and we're both new parents, that's another interaction. If we are another facet of connection, and you can start to see how you can begin to layer other things. Like if we're interested in a certain type of music or food or any number of other things. So that's where those social spaces become really important, because they start to weave a stronger safety net, if you will, to kind of protect and nurture those relationships over time. And so not everything should or needs to be loaded into the functional role. It's all about understanding the larger person and creating ways for people to connect on all of those different dimensions. So the more opportunities that people have to connect across different facets of their life, across moments in time, the stronger the potential you're going to have for better relationships. And you can start to weave a really kind of tight structure from a culture standpoint within your organization. Fantastic question.
Thank you. This is an observation from Brian, but I'd love your comments on this observation. I truly believe in the power of the office in its ability to coexist in a future flexible work. It is the cadence of teams and teams agreements in offices, that the calibration of the work setting to support relationship-based work that needs further work.
100%. And that word calibration, I think, is really key. This is not something that you're going to identify once and be done with it. Just like that analogy that I used of like airline status, it's like you've got to keep earning it. And so one of the other big shifts, I think, in workplace planning and design is, I mentioned at the beginning that I think it's really unfortunate that the word design carries all of this air of finality and completeness. And that's just not the way that life works. Like, we need to approach the design of our workplaces in a way that is very fluid and iterative, that really moves along in tandem with the fluid nature of how communities form and evolve over time within organizations to meet the changing needs of the organization. So all of this is a very dynamic balance. So having that ongoing dialogue around what are we trying to achieve? What do we have now that can help us achieve that? What could be better? And how do we take those things that could be better and start to implement and test so that we're continually iterating? This notion of building team working agreements is something that should absolutely happen, but then be revisited on some cadence. And that cadence needs to be defined based on each organization and how quickly their both internal and external realities are changing. And so we should always be having these dialogues around, are our tools fit for purpose? And when I say tool, I'm including the workplace within that. Any good craftsperson always spends time taking care of their tools to make sure that they're at peak performance. And we should be thinking about our workplace in very much the same way.
Thank you. Jan asks, Joseph, is there a connection between this thinking around workspace and relationships and organizational design? If so, could you elaborate?
Oh, for sure. I mean, everything is related. And I always think of these things almost in kind of like holographic scales. And a lot of this comes down to, within MillerKnoll's global research and planning, we approach all of our work with this, what we refer to as an ecological perspective, or the basis of human ecology from an academic study standpoint. And this is basically looking at how the individual is connected to the group, is connected to the organization, is connected to the industry, the global region. It's all in this like interwoven web, and they all follow the same general dynamics, but just at different scales. And so it's this notion of thinking about the structure of these relationships and how they graduate up at larger and larger scales. So these same concepts can be applied from an individual to a work team to the community. And even when you start looking at organizations that are multinational conglomerate corporations, you can use these same ideas to approach that as well, because they are by nature designed to be scaled to address larger and larger groups. And also, this is a fundamental condition of what it means to be human. Our ability to come together to approach really large ideas together is something that is fundamentally core to the human condition. And I think that that's something that's really important to acknowledge. And then the last thing that I would say on that is, it might seem daunting or overwhelming to think of something that large, but the thing that I love about this is that you can start very, very small. You can start with you and the people that you talk to on a regular basis. And then you can go to the next tier, and then you can go to the next tier. It's very, very rational. And so all you have to do is kind of take a step back, take a deep breath, and focus on what's in front of you immediately and then start working out from there. And as you find things that work, then you find things that you can scale. So as soon as you find something that works and that you can repeat, then you try it at the next level. And this is really key when you're wanting to make big change within an organization, to find groups, find people that that you trust, so pilot your ideas with a friendly audience first, work out the mechanics. And then once you've got confidence in that dynamic, then you try a bigger challenge or a bigger group. And then you go to the next one, and then you go to the next one. And I think that there's a lot of tendency in our industry to want to use these kind of rote global statistics as opposed to building our own individualized and personal metrics within an organization. Now, the big difference there is that if you build your own metrics of success and your own path forward as an organization, that is much more sustainable than designing all of your structure and your entity based on completely external factors or statistics and data points that were built for someone else's organization.
Great, thank you. A very practical question. In the 6 settings, there was an assembly and then there was a meeting. What's the difference between an assembly and a meeting?
That's a good question. And the difference there is between the group and the community dynamic. So we use the word assembly at the community level. So this is multiple groups coming together and meeting at that group level. So this is one defined group, like one team, if you will. Whereas that assembly at that community stage is multiple teams or multiple groups coming together. So back to the comment that I was making earlier around all of these ideas scale, that's an example of kind of the scaling of those dynamics, that the meeting dynamic happening between one defined group or the assembly dynamic happening at that kind of larger community scale.
Another quite practical challenge. 2 or 3 people have raised this issue, and Reagan has summarized it. How are these spaces with flexible mobile furniture supporting technology needs, or maybe more the power needs to keep all the tech charged? We're moving from a larger group brainstorming session to a breakout or one or two, and possibly back to presentation, etc. How are we going to manage that? So, very practical question there.
Yeah, and that question specifically is really informing changes in how we're approaching the design of product and the shape of our product portfolio. Creating more furnishings that are multi-purpose, that are mobile, that are more lightweight, that are designed in such a way that send signals to the brain that say, hey, you can move me across the room and you should. And making a clear distinction between those types of objects and others that are really intended to stay in one place. And so using this thinking around how environments are structured differently and creating furnishings that really line up with that in tandem is really key. Now on the technology and power piece, this is also coming into play as the world moves more towards universal power standards like USB-C power connection, for instance, is something that's really key, starting to integrate that more into the furnishings so that you can have more of a universal access to power. That is also a much more lightweight way to distribute power across the floor plate. So whether you've got little ports that are embedded within furnishings or mobile battery packs or other ways to kind of distribute those, we've seen a great kind of proliferation of new ways to distribute power in a light way and in a flexible way around the floor plate so that you can enable this flexibility of moving back and forth. On the digital technology communications point, when you're talking about audio and video connection, it's really important to understand the adjacency considerations when you're laying out different types of settings so that you're placing them in a way that they are complementary to adjacent settings and not at conflict with. And so being really careful if you've got something where people are engaging in a lot of video and audio communications and not locating that environment next to something that's really geared for individual heads down focus. And we've seen very recently actually some advances in technology that allow for filtering and depth of view. Like I've got this, I love my beautiful Eames plywood screen behind me. But this is something where new technology is emerging, where you can actually set depth parameters on the video field to only pick up information that's within a certain distance of the camera, but also within spatial audio as well. This is something very, very recently seeing some of these types of technologies that further advance the ability to have these flexible environments. One last thing that I will say on this is that having flexible environments, like there were a couple images that had lots of chairs on casters and individual laptop tables, having that flexibility to give teams the ability to group and cluster in different ways is really important, because it allows the team to decide how the digital technology is going to show up in their workflow and gives them the ability to set that for their preference. But it also kind of forces that conversation a little bit to have a deeper dialogue around what is the best way to get things done. So there are lots of factors that roll into that question, but there are also lots of new developments both in product and technology that are enabling some of these dynamics.
Joseph, we're up to time. I've put your email address if people, and I will share with you the chat with loads of questions, and I can always, people will have registered with their email so we can respond to some of those. I would also just wanted to mention some research that you might want to look at is the work of Robert Putnam around social capital. It's all about bridging and bonding, which is very much what we've been talking about, and I'll see if I can find something to share with you guys as well on that. Joseph, thank you very much for a fantastic session. I just wanted to highlight also that Ryan Anderson in February will be covering some of the technical questions that you have been asking as well in that talk. So do look at the events on the list that I've just posted and do register for that as well. That is in February. Joseph, thank you for a great session, and I look forward to sharing all the chat with you. Thank you
My
very
pleasure.
much.
Thank you, everyone.